I'd like to open by thanking Jeff for his opening comments and gave us a great context for what I'm about to talk about here. This presentation builds on some of those themes and it does actually dive into some of the data. This presentation also is part of setting the context for our activity with the CASA team today in doing the sector safety risk profile workshop for gliding and glider towing. So it's about you being aware of the risks and some of the data that's behind the risks. Now I see Sid's in the room, my predecessor. He has always been an advocate of understanding better error correction and safety one. He's also a strong advocate for safety two, which is not just about correcting errors, but building the positive ingredients for safety in ourselves, in our clubs, in our teams, in our systems. The positive ingredients. This presentation is focused on a lot of safety one stuff, some data of things going wrong. Okay, but the required priority is for us to do both well, to reduce errors and build the positive ingredients. So let's see. This is what we're talking about today. What does the data tell us? I want to take you through a journey through the evolution of our reporting systems, the data collection and investigation capabilities we have. Trends in occurrences, both recurrent and also historical, the changes in focus and safety priorities over the years. And this is an important issue. The systems and the taxonomies, the categories of data that we use, affect what we measure, and therefore they affect what we're aware of, how we can change our behaviours and our practices in future. So, I've got a warning here. The purpose of this is not to assign blame, but to actually improve our aviation safety outcomes. Awareness, building better safety outcomes. There is some sensitive comment. We are going to be talking about some issues and incidents where there are limitations. There are things recently that have happened that are still subject to coronial and judicial processes. So there's limits to what we can say and disclose, but we will share as much as we can. And there are some confronting issues, because when we look at what has gone wrong, people, members, clubs and communities are all affected. Okay? So, this gets tough. We've got to respect people's lives. So, here we've got a bit of a look at a timeline of the evolution of our systems, and I've done a deep dive and created a spreadsheet from hell and looked at our occurrence data from 1969 to present. Now, on the tables, there's actually a few copies of some occurrence data and some summaries of that data, which don't get hypnotised by them now, but there are information resources on your table that you can have a look at that are relevant later. Back in the old days, 60s and 70s, we had sporadic data, and it was the old Department of Civil Aviation, Department of Transport enterprise. And that was interesting. That evolved into what they called DCA. GFA was doing its thing. And in those days, we had some very good people in Gliding Australia, Gliding Federation, who were involved in assisting and advising. The Bob Halls, Mike Valentines of the world. Great names, great expertise. But it was very much sporadic effort on high-profile incidents and working with the departmental officials in those days. In the 80s and 90s, we saw evidence of some concerted actions addressing high-profile accidents. There were notable tug upsets and winch wire collisions and mid-air collisions that had a big effect on the movement, and they drove changes in how we did stuff. We saw changes in our operating practices, radio, training, stall spin prevention, winch safety. Now, the organisation's changed. CAA became CASA plus Air Services Australia, and ATSB was later formed in the mid-90s, I think, and they started doing investigations and building capabilities, and we've had to adjust to that. Meanwhile, GFA in those days lost pretty well all of its paper-based records in a bushfire at Junee, Kevin Olahead's place. In the bushfire, that's where we lost decades of paper-based wisdom that had been collected. So we've had to rediscover some of that. But we've got probable gaps in our data and analysis from those days. About 15 years ago, we started looking at electronic systems, and we started working with a company called ASN, Aviation Safety Network, and we built a system called IRIS, which was based on ICAO and CASA nomenclatures and taxonomies, which were more appropriate for powered aircraft. But then we had SAW introduced in the early 2010s, and that started on paper and became electronic, and now we've got what we have. Our investigative capabilities have improved with our interfaces with Defence and CASA, Air Services and ATSB, and yes, the demands on us to do these things well are somewhat higher. Now, looking at the trends, the data, the early years from 69 to 96 were a bit rough from a safety point of view. And I'd like you to note the changing trends in the fatal accident numbers and the 10-year average fatal accident rates at the end of those decades. Okay, it's just a single data point, 10-year average at the end of that decade. But I'd also like you to note that those high accident numbers, and a lot of them were driven by mid-air collisions involving tow planes and GA aircraft. So some of the data we've actually harvested is for gliding fatalities only, but also we're looking now at an aggregate rate which includes those involving tow planes and powered aircraft. Note the key categories of concern: loss of control, stall spin, and mid-air collision. LOC, loss of control; SS, stall spin; MAC, mid-air collision. So we transitioned to IRIS and SAW from the late 90s through to 2016. In the late 90s, early part of the century, we saw a reduced accident rate, or perhaps that was the loss of records in the bushfire. And then we transitioned to using IRIS and SAW. And in that time, we've actually seen more reporting, and you can see the upward reporting trends on the left-hand side of this slide. People started getting used to it. Terrific, we've got a reporting system. Categories of concern, still the same: loss of control, stall spin, mid-air collision, and some pretty horrible accidents involving a lot of airframes. Now we've got these maturing capabilities, recent times, maturing systems of data collection analysis. But despite concerted efforts, we've still had bad years and more fatalities. And categories of concern coming into loss of control, stall spin, terrain collision, mid-air collision, and some notable accidents involving airworthiness, propulsion systems, in-flight fire, and so on. And those numbers, a 10-year average is 1.1 per annum glider, or 1.4 if you can include tow planes and other aircraft. Our 5-year average, which is more a norm of what we're tracking continuously, at the moment it's 1.2 per annum glider and 1.8 all aircraft. Now we're talking about small data samples. But, you know, any single accident is actually having a fair effect on this. Now, what does that look like in terms of lines and trends? Now, this is gliding fatalities only from 1969 to present. And you can see those big, horrible blue lines coming up with bad years and high casualty collisions and other events. The red line is the rolling 5-year average. But if you look back in the 70s and 80s, you saw those peaks there and the accident rate was pretty bad. In the 90s, you see that dip, and possibly that's hidden by lost records. And then recently, we're starting to see some spikes of high casualty, high fatality years. Our challenge is to reduce those rates, to better prepare our pilots, mitigate ops and airworthiness risks. And I remind everyone, and some of you have got recent experience in this department, that each one of these accidents has real human impacts. It affects lives, families and friends, members, clubs, communities. It affects this whole organisation. It affects those of us who are involved in the investigation and harvesting the lessons from these accidents. Some of this stuff is pretty confronting and emotionally tough to review, but we have to do it. And as Jeff said, we must use accidents in a manner that actually, as much as possible, prevents the repeats. We have that obligation. Now, what we measure affects what we might be able to manage and control, and here's where we've got some issues about design of what I call taxonomies. This is the systems of how we analyse data. With SAW, okay, we've got categories of damage and injury, the phase of flight, ground ops, thermaling, outlanding or whatever, types of launch, and then we look at different occurrence and accident types, which might be airspace or operational or airworthiness, etc. At level 2, on the right-hand side, there's this taxonomy, a breakdown of major categories of meaningful data, and this is traceable to ICAO and CASA and ATSB taxonomies, but it is different. It's been tailored for the glider-specific environment. And they include priority accident occurrence types. Aircraft control is one of the big ones. Aircraft separation, airframe events, runway events and incursions, terrain collision, crew and cockpit safety, all those things. Now, the summary sheets on the table that I've provided you is a text version of these taxonomies, and it actually gives you some stats about the numbers of incidents that we have had against these major level 2 categories. They are broken down further in level 3, and that's where we get to the specific causal pathways within each of those elements. So that taxonomy summary handout is to help us understand the risk exposure and the relative frequency of SAW reports in these areas. Think about the number of actual incidents that might be quite different from what is reported. How many don't get reported? How many almost an incident but a near miss or an incident just avoided? How many of those are actually not reported? So there's, in your club, in your own experience, there's tacit knowledge about what can go wrong that might actually not be documented, might not be traced and tracked to use to understand trends and the need for specific action. So, as an example, airframe events includes a category called canopy. How many canopy accidents do we have? We've had too many. Most of them have reasonable outcomes without people coming to harm, but recently we've had one where it resulted in a fatality. And then when we looked at the airworthiness data for canopy incidents, we started to understand some more things and a need for higher priority action. Now, the taxonomy is pretty useful in that it tells us some really good stuff about the things that have gone wrong with the aircraft or the flight crew, the pilot. It's about collecting those facts, and the source system is about trying to gather that up front. And for the serious and fatal accidents, we do deeper dives and try and understand the complete range of driving factors. But the taxonomy, behind some of those accidents where we might say loss of control, there's important stuff that's missing, because there are organisational factors and human factors that have actually been part of those chains of causation. And I stress, for serious and fatal accidents, we do always assess the organisational and human factors as part of it. Our IT systems, our source system and analysis, needs to evolve to capture more of this important stuff that's missing. So let's look at some specific examples. Rock and roll. This is the first one I investigated when I was RMO New South Wales. It's going back a few years, but it's a stark reminder of what occurs. And in this particular case, it was a mid-air collision between a Blarney launching on the winch wire and a mini Nimbus coming into land. Mid-air collision, loss of control, bang, fatality. But what was behind that accident? The facts were there was a mid-air collision. But there were a whole bunch of organisational factors that led to that, and some human factors. The launch point position was actually hard up against a line of trees that restricted visibility of other aircraft in the circuit. There were radio calls not heard. There were issues with radio settings and procedures. So there were a bunch of organisational things that drove a reduced awareness, and then the airspace was not adequately cleared for launch. The launch started as the mini Nimbus descended over the trees into the launching Blarney. That is a case of an organisational accident as much as an operational accident. That was a pretty rough scene, that one. Another one that we looked at carefully. We've seen the variations on this theme over the years. There was a fatality with a loss of control and terrain collision, stall spin, out of Benalla with a Nimbus outlanding. Good pilot. Lots of experience. But he was doing his low-level thermaling, and there were definitely human factors driving here and some social pressures to get home. He had that goal fixation, the mission focus that Jeff spoke about. And so it was about, I've got to try and avoid the outlanding if I can. And he tried hard. He tried really hard. And eventually he tried to do a turn in a bubble just next to a known safe outlanding paddock. And in that turn, losing energy at very low level, he decided, I have to outland. And at the last minute, it's quite clear that he swapped hands to operate the undercarriage. And in the process of activating the undercarriage lever, back pressure on the stick with the non-preferred hand, the left hand, and it went into an immediate spin and hit the ground. Unrecoverable. Low-level stall spin. But there were a bunch of social and human factors that drove the error, the late decisions with tragic consequences. More recently, this is a bit rough, this one. Mount Beauty, loss of control and terrain collision. Grob 109 touring motor glider crashed at Mount Beauty. This one makes it pretty sad. It was a tragic accident with the Grob 109 doing a low-level pass down the runway to scatter ashes of a flying friend. The experienced pilot was flying with the late friend's daughter, and that was a change in plan from the original, where there were another pilot was going to be co-pilot, and the scattering ashes was originally planned to be done at altitude close to one of the mountain lookouts in that area. But key people in the family couldn't get up and walk around that lookout area, so they replanned and resequenced the flight, and it was a low-level pass over the runway was plan B. And at very low level at the far end of the runway, the horrified crowd saw the touring motor glider lose control, abruptly nose down into the undershoot area with a cloud of ashes coming out of the back of the aircraft. The ashes scattering mechanism was a piece of rectangular conduit with a plunger. So, yes, there was a loss of control and terrain collision. Question is why? Yes, there are particular things that could have happened leading to interference or stall or whatever. It's a really tough one. We'll never really know. But here, there were also organisational factors in terms of the decisions and the planning of the event, social pressures, possible in-cockpit distractions, and running out of hands. So that's a tough one. Lots of human factors there. Most recently, this one is raw for some of you, and I'm sorry, but that's the part of what we're dealing with. But there's some important organisational factors coming out of this. It was a first evaluation flight in the AS33MI, okay? And that photo there shows the destruction of the wings, but it also shows that the batteries in the wings were damaged and compromised, and that in itself leads to a real challenge for us. The accident was loss of control and terrain collision. Why the loss of control? We'll probably never know the true cause. And this is where our investigative capabilities had to come to the fore, particularly through John Warrington with some advanced analysis. But we were then able to model the behaviour. Now, when you analyse the data trace from GPS and FLAM, etc., you can actually model the aircraft's motion, but the systems we normally use assume that the aircraft is upright. And using that, when you played those back, you had these impossible manoeuvres taking place. So we had to modify our analysis to actually look at motion and dynamics in the aircraft frames of reference, and look at the accelerations, pitch rates, roll rates, angle of attack, airspeed. We were actually to ascertain that that aircraft was actually inverted for some considerable time prior to the final descent into the ground. We didn't find airworthiness causes. We didn't find any evidence of an in-flight defect that might have driven those manoeuvres, but they certainly weren't normal manoeuvres that people would do on an evaluation flight. So that begs the question about other potential drivers. But we do know that there were long delays before that flight, trying to seek airworthiness certification, finishing inspections. There are major organisational issues that we're dealing with here, and some of that is in the emergency response, because we couldn't get to the incident site. There were delays in emergency services and gliding people being able to get to the site because of the concerns about battery safety, and we had to get people back to disable and make them safe before we could get into this in detail. So there's going to be all sorts of issues flowing into airworthiness, into OSTIV and aircraft certification, placarding, crashworthiness. There's lots of follow-up to do there, and the organisational issues need to be looked at in detail. So those instances indicate post-accident discovery of organisational and human factors that might have contributed to chains of causation and response. But broadly, we need to search these out, record them, and understand better how they affect us. I commend to you, there's a Flight Safety Australia article, The 7 Deadly Sins, that talks about some of the biases and things that can go wrong. It's a great reference, talks about confirmation bias, continuation bias, expectations. Well worth reading. But we've also got human factors that we need to understand in terms of our decision frames that lead to the errors and the lapses and occasionally violations. And we're all subject to normalised deviance as individuals. What do we normally get away with on a daily basis when we're actually flying? What are we doing that's not quite right? Fatigue, distraction, overload, things driving situational awareness breakdowns, they're high priority for us to understand, but we don't have lots of data for this. The data systems need to evolve to capture some of these post-accident insights and help us understand those trends. Organisational factors, similarly, Defence does this well with the seashell model, and we've got some references that describe that here. But we're all subject to normalised deviance in our clubs. We're all subject to potential accident drivers that might come from our facilities and resources, our lack of information, use of incorrect data, systems and processes. So, this is about what the airworthiness data tells us. And I had this slide in our 2024 discussions, and Anthony Smith and the airworthiness team, that's really our only source of data about what hours are we flying? How do we understand our accident rates in terms of per 1,000 flights or 1,000 hours? We don't have good pilot data. And when people put in SOAR reports, those fields about pilot experience in the last 12 months or the last 90 days are often blank or, wild approximations. So from the airworthiness data, we know how many launches and landings they've done. We know how many hours they've flown. And then we do some division between single-seaters and two-seaters, numbers of pilots involved. But the outcome of this analysis is that our accident rates, 80,000 hours or 72,000 landings or 110,000 pilot hours per fatality. So we've got a success rate of 99.88% and a fatal accident rate that is much lower, 0.12%. So most of the time we're doing things right. Now, this is not counting flights resulting in injury or serious injury. That's still there, but this is the raw data at the worst case level. There's a famous web resource online many of you have seen. It's called Chess in the Air. I highlight that there's a really good article in there called The Risk of Dying Doing What We Love, and it's looking at accident rates for various activities compared to a benchmark in commercial aviation, which is, 1 death in 10 million operating hours, chance of dying 0.01% in the next 1,000 hours. Okay, that's the benchmark. And it then starts to look at generally safe activities like driving, which is inherently pretty dangerous, skiing in Colorado, cycling. Well, depends when you're cycling. I'd say Australian cycling death rates are probably a bit higher. There's generally safe activities. And somewhat dangerous, we're starting to get into the, backcountry stuff, equestrian riding, who's fallen off a horse, yeah, it hurts. And then we get into the dangerous activities, the scuba diving, motorcycling, I note that a lot of us glider pilots have got side activities in these dangerous sports too. But gliding there, and this is based on the data out of Germany and France. The author here saw one death in 50,000 hours, or 6 years. Deaths in the next 1,000 hours, 2%. Okay? It's 200 times as dangerous as commercial aviation. And going back to the earlier data from the airworthiness data, our data was about half that, twice as safe, but still pretty bloody dangerous compared to commercial aviation. And then we get into the very dangerous and insane stuff. If you're into Formula One or base jumping, I hope it's an exciting life. So, but those are some baselines that are out there. But we don't have the means to actually do the same comparative assessments from our data and systems. We need to evolve those over time, and that might be a good research project for someone downstream. So, our top 5 occurrence categories. Our top 5, you've got it in your handouts. By far the biggest. There's a whole bunch of categories: driving aircraft control accidents or loss of control, stall spin, hard landings, they're all in there. 400 odd, 21%. 21% of our occurrence reports relate to aircraft control issues. 12.5% relate to aircraft separation, mid-air collisions and near misses. Aircraft separation. That in turn driven by a whole bunch of issues that might affect airworthiness of radios and FLARMs and ADS-B and so on. The quality of our training and our lookout, our risk appetite when we're launching ourselves into a crowded gaggle. So there's a whole bunch of behavioural issues that can affect this, as you know. Runway events, incursions, excursions, things going wrong on the ground. There's a pretty high category there. That's 11.7%, 200 plus occurrence reports. Airframe events, canopies, landing gear, all the defects that might affect a glider. 9.9% of our reporting is indicating issues with airframes. Terrain collisions and obstacle strikes, 7.3%. Those are our top 5 and they're reflected in our current priorities. Our current priorities: aircraft control, mid-air collision, runway events, airframe events, terrain collisions. That's in the statement, and that aligns really well with the CASA national aviation safety priorities as well. But what other safety focus areas are needed? This is part of today's discussion and the workshops later today. We may need to look at some other priority areas. And I note recent efforts by the airworthiness team to look at, connection issues, rigging issues. We're going to be adding canopies to this shortly. We're also associate members of the European Gliding Union's Safety Working Group, and the EASA priorities are aircraft upset or loss of control, airborne collision, obstacle collisions in flight. Not sure what that is completely catching, but that might involve a few wires across valleys and other obstacles. The EGU, European Gliding Union priorities, are very much about abnormal runway contact, which is hard landings and thumping into the ground, loss of control in flight from numerous causes, collision with obstacles on takeoff and landing. That's a big one. That might be skewed by their high use of winch and operating out of very, very small, tight environments. And they are giving extra attention to rigging issues and winch launches. So that's what the Europeans are doing. But they're using different taxonomies. Same with the Brits. Completely different taxonomies to us. Their taxonomies are based on powered aircraft environments. Their taxonomies have an outlanding as equating an emergency, whereas for us, an outlanding is a routine issue. It's not an emergency per se. So, what areas should have greater safety focus in future? That needs to be informed by our discussions with each other over the next day, and our workshop, the SSRP activity later today. I would suggest, and this is Drew's list, I think that we might need a more careful look at power plant issues, all the risks associated with the evolving technologies in self-launching and touring gliders. New technology risks, various. Training-induced risks. I've been having some conversations. The way we train people sometimes is introducing greater risks in some of our operations, and I think we've got to look more critically at that. This is getting to the human factors. Ground handling and taxiing. To use a military metaphor, you don't want cheap kills, self-inflicted damage to your own equipment and systems by mishandling on the ground, but there's a horribly high trend here. Human factors is the big one. We've got to actually, I think, be much more assertive about training and looking at different ways of reducing barriers to situational awareness, reducing distractions, digital hypnotism, or as I call it, in-flight distraction devices, and looking at the risks associated with our airworthiness. Sometimes there's maintenance-induced defects, and sometimes there are defects that are actually a consequence of poor pilot maintenance or pilot-allowed maintenance. And I know the airworthiness team are trying to improve that. So, those are the nasty things I'd like to focus on, but we also, and this gets back to the things that Sid and other luminaries have been advocating for a long period. We can't just focus on the errors and what goes wrong. We've got to also focus on building the positive capacities within ourselves and within our clubs and our overall organisation that gives us the higher capacities to do the right things for a positive environment. That positive culture that Jeff was talking about. The positive conversations need to be looked at, and we put this in a safety bulletin recently that looked at spectrums of success, and you might assess yourself or your club as being in the red end on some things like, island mindsets or not invented here biases, or inclusive and positive nirvana capabilities, which are all about sharing resources and insights across boundaries. But these are things that can be looked at by club CFIs and panel chairs, by club organisations, and by us as groups of like-minded glider pilots wanting to make it better for everyone. So with that, I thank you for your time and your attention. I hope you have lots of fun. That's me in my happy place in the 20s, soaring above a wave cloud. It's really lovely. It's nice. So have fun, keep it safe. Happy landings.